Welcome to my lecture on pre-Columbian civilizations and their downfall. I'll be breaking this lecture up into a few parts, and in this first part I'll discuss early development of American civilizations and how they grew a little bit differently from other parts of the world. And I'll start off with some of the earliest known American civilizations, which are the Norte-Chico civilization in Peru, which started around the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, and the Olmec civilization in southern Mesoamerica, which may have started around the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE. And both of these civilizations constructed monumental and communal architecture, such as these Norte-Chico stepped pyramids and this Olmec giant stone head. The Olmecs were they became quite famous for their large stone heads. They made quite a few of these. And both of these civilizations also developed complex social, political, and economic structures, as well as organized religion. And both of these cultures were quite successful, so they both lasted for hundreds of years and kind of left a cultural imprint on their various areas where they developed that would kind of maybe influence future cultures to some degree. And another very impressive early Mesoamerican civilization was the Mayan civilization, which took off around the start of the Common Era. It developed a bit earlier than that, but that's when they really got going, around the start of the Common Era. And in addition to having rich culture, religion, and architecture, similar to the first two civilizations I mentioned, the Maya also made many important technological and academic advancements. So the Maya had an impressive and prolific written language, as well as an advanced calendar system, which you may have heard of. It's gotten some attention in the past. But perhaps the most impressive advancement that the Mayan civilization made was their use of basic mathematics. And you can see it here. Actually, this is their number system. It's actually base 20, as opposed to our base 10 system. As you can see, it goes from 0 to 19. And actually, a notable fact about the Mayan mathematical system is that it did include the concept of zero, which might be surprising, but it's not a universal concept. Some of the other early mathematical systems that arose around the world did not include the concept of zero, which actually hindered them quite a bit, made them less effective as mathematical systems. So this was a very effective mathematical system, and it influenced every aspect of Mayan civilization, from construction to commerce, trading, and to timekeeping, like those calendars I mentioned earlier. All these parts of Mayan society benefited greatly from mathematics. And so, as you can see from these examples that I've presented so far, the Americas are very capable of fostering the development of, advanced civilizations. But despite this, civilizations in the Americas developed considerably slower than civilizations in other parts of the world. Specifically, Mesopotamian civilizations may have appeared as early as 6000 BCE, which are millennia before the Norte-Chico civilizations coalesced, which were the very first civilizations in America. And the Sumerians were already using a written language by the end of the 4th millennium BCE, which is many hundreds of years before the Olmecs would create the very first written language in the Americas. And ancient Egyptians were known to utilize algebra by the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, which is long before the Maya grasped basic arithmetic. So why did these civilizations in other parts of the world develop so much faster than those in America? Well, one common theory is that the answer essentially boils down to geographic and ecological dumb luck. So the meager number of domesticated crops and animals in the Americas is just dwarfed by those that were present in Eurasia, in Europe and Asia specifically. So for example here, we you've got sheep, but you've also got like horses, pigs, cows, all sorts of creatures that can be domesticated and used for food or as pack animals, stuff like that. And then you've also got all these great crops like wheat here or rice, and they're just really good hardy crops that can be grown in massive quantities in bulk, that can supply food to very densely populated, advanced, civilized societies. And I mean, there's just like in America, on the other hand, you've got llamas in South America, but that's pretty much it as far as domesticable animals go. And llamas, llamas aren't that great. They're kind of not the most useful. And then as for plants, I mean, eventually the Americas would develop corn, which would become a very successful staple crop, but that would actually take a very long time to domesticate and become, very successful. So the Americas were really at a disadvantage when it came to domesticable plants and animals. And in Eurasia, all these great plants and animals, they just allowed the people there to more easily transfer into an agrarian lifestyle, which gave them a head start on all the other steps towards advancing their civilizations. And another significant factor is the geographic configuration of the Americas is very skinny and vertical, as opposed to the wide sprawling mass of Eurasia. And this large, horizontal landmass allowed the easier transfer of all these great useful plants and animals latitudinally across Eurasia's surface. And this works because, as you move left to right, like I said, latitudinally across Eurasia, climate varies quite little because, as you move latitudinally, sunlight exposure remains relatively the same. Which means that one animal that lives in one part of Eurasia, if you move it left or right, the climate's going to vary quite little, and that animal or plant is going to have a higher chance of being able to survive there. And in the Americas, this is kind of the opposite. So, the already scant like crops and animals present in the Americas will have a much harder time adjusting to being moved up, its tall, skinny frame, where climates vary wildly, due to longitudinal changes in sun exposure. As you move up and down, if you think about it like on a globe, up and down the Earth's surface, sunlight exposure changes, and which changes the climate. And you may have noticed I've been talking about Eurasia, and in this last slide I mentioned Egypt as an example. And just as a side note, yeah, it's a little different. They had some different advantages, but I'm not going to get into the weeds. It mostly involves, the Nile River being like a really, really good river. But like I said, I'm not going to get into the weeds. In general, suffice it to say that other parts of the world had some very significant advantages that gave them a head start at building civilizations before the Americas did. And now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the dominant forces in the Americas right as the Europeans discovered the continents. And so by the 16th century, the Aztec Empire was the dominant force in Mesoamerica, and the Inca was their South American counterpart. So these are the two main empires that I'll be discussing from here on out. And I'll start a bit with how the Aztec people emerged. And they emerged sometime in the 12th century in northern Mexico, though they would eventually migrate southward into Mesoamerica in the 1300s, where they would found the city of Tenochtitlan on an island in Lake Texcoco. And legend states that they stopped and settled, where they saw a sign from one of their gods, an eagle clutching a serpent atop a cactus, which, as you can see, it's just this image is immortalized here in the Mexican flag. Kind of an interesting anecdote. And under the rule of Itzcoatl, the Aztec civilization would become the dominant force in the early 15th century. And they would do this by forming alliances with some of the other significant forces in the area, specifically the Texcoco and Tlacopan peoples, and they would go on to grow their empire further through both trade and also warfare through conquering. And eventually, their empire would end up ruling around 5 or 6 million people by 1519. And by this time, actually, the Aztec Empire would become kind of an amalgam of an estimated like 400 to 500 smaller peoples that they had conquered, which would actually end up leading to some division and instability in the structure of the empire, which, as you might see, will come into play a bit later on. And Tenochtitlan, that capital city I mentioned earlier where the Aztecs supposedly first settled, as the empire grew, this city would grow into a thriving metropolis. It would grow into a 5 square mile city and would house at least 140,000 people. So, super dense population. And one remarkable technology utilized by the Aztecs that allowed them to kind of expand the city out onto the lake, because Tenochtitlan is on an island in the middle of a lake. But they actually use these things called chinampas to expand out into the water. And chinampas were essentially a floating garden bed, which was made up of rich mud harvested from the lake's bottom. That was kind of Lake Texcoco's bottom, this lake here, which was kind of put onto a raft and used to grow plants on to great effect. It was a very, very effective agricultural tactic that allowed them to supply the city with food. And then there's the Incan civilization, which was the kind of the parallel to the Aztec civilization, except in South America. So Incan origins are actually largely unknown. Much of it is actually locked away in these untranslatable quipus, which is the kind of an Incan method of writing or storing information. It's these strings with knots tied in them at intervals, arranged in this this kind of pattern. Like I said, we haven't been able to translate them yet. Maybe someday we'll figure it out. But as of yet, all our information on Incan origins has been gathered from accounts of Europeans who interacted with the Inca, and also through some oral memorizations within the Incan culture, and also through archaeology of Incan sites. But we do know that Incan civilization began around the 12th century around the Cuzco Valley in Peru. And the Incan Empire, starting in the 15th century, began to grow, and after 100 years they would control a large swath of northwest South America. And the Incas would expand their empire by conquering neighboring tribes and then gathering workers from those tribes to kind of provide labor for them, and then setting up like military encampments throughout the territory that they conquered kind of as they went, which was kind of their general strategy. And at their peak, the Inca controlled around 12 million people, so just absolutely massive. And as you can see here, their empire stretched all the way from Ecuador through Peru and down into northern Chile. So just very impressive, massive empire. And Incan architecture was actually some of the most impressive in the Americas. And the bricks used in Incan structures were actually so precisely masoned that they held together without the use of mortar. And they were actually, these constructions were actually strong enough to withstand the very frequent earthquakes that ravaged this area. So, I mean, just superb craftsmanship. And in addition to these structures that the Incas created, they also built this very extensive road network all throughout their empire, which was very efficient and very effective. And besides the functionality and aesthetics of these massively crafted structures and this road network, these constructions would become a powerful signature or symbol of the Incan Empire's power. So it would become like a strong symbol to the peoples that they conquered. So it served a both functional and kind of psychological purpose. And that's where I'm going to leave part one. And when I come back, I will begin discussing how the Europeans arrive and how they conquer the Incas and the Aztecs.